I want you to listen closely, because this story starts in a way that hits harder than you'd expect. A man with everything, power, money, respect, finds himself utterly lost. Everything he built vanished overnight. No flashy headlines, no scandal, just silence. And in that silence, the cruelest kind of loneliness settled in. You might be folding laundry right now, waiting for your next shift, or closing your eyes after a long day serving others. Maybe you're on a bus heading home, or standing in a kitchen that isn't yours but feels more familiar than your own. It doesn't matter where you are, this story will surprise you. It's about loss you didn't see coming and hope you didn't think possible. This is Chicago, the wind howling off Lake Michigan with a bite that cuts through even the thickest winter coat. The distant rumble of L trains echoing through streets full of grit and dreams, where fortunes are made and lost faster than the seasons change. In this city of broad shoulders and broken promises, money flows like the Chicago River, sometimes swift and powerful, sometimes stagnant and cold. Nathan Whitman once commanded this city's respect. His real estate empire stretched from the Gold Coast to Lincoln Park, his investment portfolio heavy with stocks that climbed like the Willis Tower itself, his assets carefully diversified across properties, bonds, and even cryptocurrency, Bitcoin purchases that seemed visionary when the market soared. He was worth $47 million on paper, a net worth that opened doors, commanded attention, and bought silence when necessary. But paper burns quickly in Chicago's harsh winds. Bad investments in emerging markets, trusted partners who turned out to be wolves in Armani suits, a series of leveraged deals that collapsed like dominoes when the economy shifted, all of it gone in 18 months. His liquid assets evaporated. His stock portfolio hemorrhaged value. His properties became liabilities he couldn't afford to maintain. The inheritance he'd planned to leave his children became debt they'd have to shoulder. The mansion on Astor Street, his last remaining asset, stood like a monument to everything he'd lost. Its grand facade hid the truth. Inside, the lights had been turned off in half the rooms to save on electric bills. The staff had been let go one by one, and Nathan wandered the empty halls like a ghost, haunting his own life. The isolation was suffocating. His 2 adult children, Sarah and Michael, had their own lives, their own families, their own disappointments with a father who'd been too busy building wealth to build relationships. His wife Emma had died 2 years earlier from cancer, and with her went the last warmth in a house that had become as cold as a bank vault. The few friends who remained were fair-weather companions who disappeared when his portfolio did. Nathan's pride, that stubborn Chicago pride that built skyscrapers and weathered storms, wouldn't let him ask for help, wouldn't let him admit the depth of his fall. He sold his luxury cars, dismissed his driver, canceled his club memberships, but still clung to the pretense that this was temporary, that his fortune would return like spring after a brutal winter. But spring seemed impossibly far away as Nathan sat alone in his study, staring at financial statements that read like obituaries for his dreams. In a quiet neighborhood on the South Side, where the houses stand close together like old friends sharing secrets, Maribel Restrepo begins each day with a prayer her grandmother taught her in Spanish, then spoken again in English for the God who hears all languages. The alarm clock rattles at 4:30, but she's usually already awake, her internal clock set by years of rising before dawn to catch buses and trains that carry her toward other people's lives. Maribel's hands tell stories, palms lined with years of scrubbing floors, fingertips rough from cleaning solutions, knuckles swollen from lifting and carrying and never quite resting. At 53, she moves with the steady rhythm of someone who's learned that endurance, not speed, wins the race. Her face, weathered by Chicago winters and lined with quiet strength, holds eyes that have seen too much sadness to be shocked by it anymore. She dresses in the same careful way each morning. Clean jeans, comfortable shoes with good arch support, a sweater that's seen better days but still keeps her warm. In her mind, she reviews the day ahead, the hour-long commute on the Red Line, packed shoulder to shoulder with other people chasing dreams and paychecks, the walk through neighborhoods where the houses grow larger and the faces grow whiter with each block. Her own small apartment holds the evidence of a life lived in service to others. Photographs of her 2 children, Maria and Carlos, both grown now but still calling every Sunday. A small savings account that never grows quite fast enough. A kitchen where she cooks the same comfort foods she makes for her employers, recipes that carry the love she doesn't always know how to express in words. The temp agency had called 3 days ago with unusual urgency in the dispatcher's voice. A Gold Coast mansion needed someone reliable, someone who could work without supervision, someone who wouldn't gossip about what they saw or steal what they touched. The pay was decent, but not exceptional. $30 an hour for housekeeping and basic meal preparation. What made it unusual was the client, Nathan Whitman, a name the dispatcher spoke with the kind of reverence reserved for old money and new tragedy. He's been through some changes, the dispatcher had explained carefully. Lost his wife a couple years back. Business hasn't been going well. He's particular about privacy. Maribel had nodded, understanding the code. Men with money, even money that was disappearing, still wanted dignity. They still needed someone who could move through their spaces without making them feel smaller than they already felt. The L train carries her through Chicago's geography of dreams and disappointments each morning, past neighborhoods where her people live and work, up toward the lake where the wealthy build walls against the world. She watches the city change through the window, the brick bungalows giving way to limestone mansions, the corner stores replaced by boutiques where a single dress costs more than she makes in a week. At the Astor Street mansion, Maribel stood before a door that could have belonged to a museum, its brass fittings gleaming despite the obvious reduction in maintenance staff. She pressed the doorbell and waited, adjusting the strap of her cleaning supply bag, listening to the hollow echo of footsteps approaching from somewhere deep inside. Nathan Whitman opened the door himself. No butler, no housekeeper, just a man who looked like he hadn't slept well in months. His hair, still thick at 58, showed more gray than his publicity photos had revealed. His clothes were expensive but wrinkled, his face carrying the weight of someone who'd forgotten how to rest. Most striking were his eyes. They held the hollow look of someone who'd lost more than money, who'd lost his place in the world. "Mrs. Restrepo," he said, his voice carrying the practiced politeness of someone who'd been raised to mind his manners even when his world was falling apart. "Thank you for coming." Maribel nodded, taking in the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, beautiful but somehow sad, like a party dress worn to a funeral. The house felt too large for human warmth, too quiet for human happiness. She could smell the absence of recent cooking, the staleness of rooms not regularly aired, the subtle mustiness that creeps in when a house becomes more like a museum than a home. "I'll show you around," Nathan continued, his footsteps echoing as he led her through rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly. The kitchen was magnificent but barely used, the stainless steel appliances cold to the touch, the granite countertops clear of everything but dust. The living areas held furniture that looked untouched, photographs in silver frames that caught the light like accusations of happier times. As they walked, Nathan spoke in the clipped tones of someone giving a business presentation rather than showing someone around their home. He explained his expectations with the thoroughness of a man who'd once commanded boardrooms, which rooms needed daily attention, which could be addressed weekly, his preferences for meal preparation, his schedule which, he admitted quietly, was mostly empty these days. "I value privacy," he said as they stood in his study, surrounded by law books and financial magazines that told the story of a world he'd once navigated with confidence. "I hope you understand that anything you see or hear here should remain confidential." Maribel met his eyes directly, seeing past the defensive politeness to the fear underneath. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying the steady authority of someone who'd earned trust rather than demanded it, I've been cleaning houses for 22 years, rich ones, poor ones, happy ones, sad ones. I don't see what isn't my business, and I don't hear what isn't meant for me. Something in Nathan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite relief, but maybe the beginning of it. He nodded and left her to her work, disappearing into the depths of the house like a shadow seeking darker corners. Alone in the kitchen, Maribel began the slow process of bringing life back to spaces that had forgotten how to breathe. She opened windows despite the October chill, letting Lake Michigan's wind carry out the staleness and carry in the possibility of change. Her movements were methodical, practiced, carrying the rhythm of someone who understood that cleaning wasn't just about removing dirt. It was about restoring order to chaos, bringing care to abandonment, making spaces ready for life again. As she worked, she noticed details that spoke of loss beyond just money. In the pantry, she found expensive ingredients that had expired unopened, evidence of plans that were made but never followed through. The refrigerator held takeout containers and frozen meals, the food of someone who'd forgotten how to feed himself properly. The dining room table was covered with papers and unopened mail, transformed from a place of gathering into another workspace in a house where work had become both salvation and curse. But it was the small things that told the real story. A coffee cup sitting cold and forgotten on a windowsill, reading glasses left open on a book that hadn't been touched in weeks, a cell phone with 17 missed calls from numbers that were probably creditors or lawyers or people who wanted things he no longer had to give. The house held its breath around her as she worked, as if waiting to see whether this new presence would bring healing or just more reminders of everything that had been lost. Maribel moved through the rooms with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is making their space clean enough, quiet enough for them to think clearly again. By the end of the first day, the transformation wasn't dramatic. It couldn't be, not yet. But the kitchen gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that invites cooking. The windows let in light that had been blocked by grime and neglect, and the air itself felt cleaner, lighter, ready for whatever might come next. Nathan appeared as she was preparing to leave, standing in the doorway like he wasn't quite sure whether he belonged in his own kitchen. Everything looks... He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound too grateful, too vulnerable. Very nice. Thank you. Maribel packed her supplies with the same methodical care she brought to everything else. I'll be back tomorrow, Mr. Whitman. Same time. As she walked back toward the L station, passing from the world of marble and crystal back to the world of brick and steel she knew better, Maribel carried with her the image of a man standing alone in a kitchen that finally looked ready for him to cook in again, even if he'd forgotten how. The October wind whipped off Lake Michigan with a bite that promised winter wasn't far behind, but Maribel pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to do the work that had become her calling, not just cleaning houses, but quietly, carefully, helping people remember how to live in them again. She had no way of knowing then that this job would become something more than work, something that would test everything she believed about forgiveness, dignity, and the strange ways that broken people sometimes find each other in a city famous for its broad shoulders and its capacity to rebuild after everything falls down. The remaining staff at the Whitman mansion regarded Maribel with the suspicious politeness reserved for someone whose position was uncertain. Mrs. Henderson, the cook who came 3 days a week, had worked for the family for 9 years and wore her seniority like armor. She was a thin woman with sharp elbows and sharper opinions who made it clear that the recent downsizing, her euphemism for the financial collapse that had cost 6 people their jobs, was a temporary inconvenience that would soon be resolved. Things will go back to normal once Mr. Whitman gets back on his feet, she announced during Maribel's second week, stirring a pot of soup with aggressive efficiency. He's just going through a rough patch. Successful men like him, they always bounce back. James, the part-time groundskeeper who now came once a week instead of daily, nodded with the kind of desperate optimism that people cling to when their own jobs depend on believing in miracles. My father worked for rich families his whole life, he said while trimming hedges that had grown wild from neglect. They always figure it out. Always. But their confidence felt forced, brittle as autumn leaves. Maribel noticed how Mrs. Henderson's eyes darted toward the expensive copper pots when she thought no one was looking, as if calculating their resale value. She heard James on the phone with another client, his voice carrying the tone of someone securing backup employment while hoping he wouldn't need it. The most uncomfortable moments came when Nathan's adult children visited. Sarah arrived first on a cold Tuesday afternoon, her Mercedes SUV looking out of place next to Maribel's bus stop across the street. She was 34 and polished in the way that comes from never having worked with her hands, her clothes carrying designer labels, her jewelry carefully chosen to suggest taste rather than ostentation. "You must be the new housekeeper," Sarah said, not unkindly, but with the distant politeness of someone who'd been raised to notice the help without really seeing them. "I'm Sarah, Nathan's daughter." Maribel was folding laundry in the main living room, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd folded thousands of other people's clothes over the years. "Mrs. Restrepo," she replied, continuing her work. "Your father mentioned you might be stopping by." Sarah perched on the edge of an antique chair, as if she wasn't quite comfortable in her childhood home anymore. "How is he?" she asked, and in that question, Maribel heard both genuine concern and the careful distance of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to fully engage. "He's managing," Maribel said carefully, because what else could she say? That she sometimes found him standing motionless in his study at 3 p.m, staring at nothing. That she'd started leaving small meals on his desk because otherwise he seemed to forget to eat. That she'd heard him on the phone with creditors, his voice carrying a humiliation that made her want to close doors and give him privacy for his pain. Michael visited later that week, bringing his own complicated energy to the house. At 31, he carried himself with the restless dissatisfaction of someone who'd grown up wealthy but had never figured out how to transform privilege into purpose. His conversation with his father, conducted in the study with the door closed, could be heard throughout the house, not the words but the emotional rhythm of it, the way voices rose and fell with frustration and disappointment. Afterward, Michael found Maribel in the kitchen, warming up leftovers for Nathan's dinner. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, leaning against the counter with casual authority. 3 weeks, Maribel replied, stirring rice that she'd cooked with the kind of care that made even simple food taste like love. "You might want to start looking for other work," Michael said, not cruelly, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a weather report. "This situation, it's not going to last much longer. Dad's living on borrowed time, and he's too proud to admit it." Maribel turned to face him, her wooden spoon still in her hand, and met his eyes with the steady gaze that had carried her through 22 years of other people's dramas. "Mr. Whitman is a good man going through a hard time," she said quietly. "I've worked for good people and bad people, rich people and poor people. The good ones deserve loyalty, especially when things get difficult." Michael's expression shifted slightly, as if he was seeing her for the first time rather than just looking at her. "You don't understand," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "He's lost almost everything. The house, his investments, even his retirement fund. He's been living off credit for months." "I understand more than you think," Maribel replied, returning her attention to the rice. "I understand what it means to lose things you thought you'd always have. I understand what it means to not know how you're going to pay next month's bills, and I understand that sometimes the people who have the least to give are the ones who need the most support." That evening, she set Nathan's dinner in his study as she'd taken to doing, along with a cup of coffee made exactly the way she'd observed he liked it, strong enough to wake the dead, as her grandmother used to say. He looked up from the financial documents scattered across his desk like leaves after a storm. "Mrs. Restrepo," he said, and she heard something different in his voice, a crack in the careful control he maintained. "I should probably tell you, your position here may not be permanent." Maribel set the plate down with the gentle precision she brought to all her tasks. "Mr. Whitman, if you need to let me go, I understand. But until you do, I'll be here doing the work. That's all you need to worry about." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Why?" he asked, and the question carried more weight than its single syllable should have been able to bear. "Why stay when everyone else is?" "Because," Maribel said without turning around, "somebody has to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. And sometimes that somebody has to be the person who's getting paid to keep the house clean while you figure out how to keep living in it." As she rode the L train home that night, watching the city lights blur past the windows, Maribel thought about the accumulation of small cruelties that poverty brings, not just the big dramatic losses, but the daily erosion of dignity that comes from having to ask for more time to pay bills, from watching people's expressions change when they realize you can't afford what you once could, from the way even family members start to pull away when your problems become inconvenient for their lives. She'd lived through her own version of this when her husband Roberto died in a factory accident 11 years ago, when the insurance company found reasons to delay payments, and the extended family who'd once gathered for Sunday dinners suddenly became too busy to visit. She remembered the weight of shame that came with accepting charity, the careful calculations required to make dignity stretch as far as dollars, the way loss could make you feel invisible even when you were surrounded by people. But she also remembered the unexpected kindnesses that had carried her through, the neighbor who left groceries on her doorstep without being asked, the teacher who made sure her children got free lunch without having to fill out forms that felt like admissions of failure, the church women who somehow always had extra clothes in exactly the right sizes when her babies outgrew what they had. Those experiences had taught her that grace was often quiet, that help was most meaningful when it came without speeches or requirements for gratitude, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was simply show up and do your work well, consistently, without making their crisis about your own need to feel needed. In the Whitman house, she was witnessing the specific kind of suffering that comes with falling from great heights, the way shame could paralyze someone who'd never learned how to ask for help, never learned how to be anything other than the person others came to for solutions. It was different from her own experience of poverty, but not entirely foreign. The isolation was the same, the way pride could become both shield and prison, the slow realization that the life you'd built could disappear faster than you'd ever imagined possible. As the train carried her home to her small apartment where the heater sometimes worked and the refrigerator was full of food she'd bought with her own money, Maribel made a decision that would have surprised Nathan if he'd known about it. She would stay as long as he needed her to stay, regardless of whether he could pay her, because sometimes keeping faith with someone meant believing in their recovery even when they couldn't believe in it themselves. She didn't know yet that this decision would cost her more than lost wages, that loyalty could become its own kind of burden, or that the man she was choosing to stand by was about to make choices that would test every principle she'd built her life around. But she knew that in a city built by people who refused to stay down after everything fell apart, someone had to be willing to help clear away the rubble so the rebuilding could begin. Tomorrow she would return to the mansion on Astor Street, not because Nathan Whitman deserved her loyalty, but because everyone deserved someone who would show up when showing up was the hardest thing to do. November settled over Chicago like a gray wool blanket, bringing the kind of cold that seeped through even the thickest coats and made the city feel smaller, more intimate, as if the harsh weather was forcing everyone to huddle closer together. In the Whitman mansion, the reduced heating costs meant that only the main floor stayed truly warm, and Maribel found herself working in sweaters, her breath sometimes visible in the unused rooms upstairs. It was during this season of settling cold that she began to notice Nathan differently, not as an employer or even as a man fallen from grace, but as someone whose grief had layers that went deeper than financial loss. She saw it first in the way he held his coffee cup, cradling it with both hands as if the warmth was more precious than the caffeine. She noticed it in how he sometimes stopped mid-sentence when speaking to her. His attention caught by something she couldn't see, some memory that pulled him away from the present moment. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when the gray November sky made 3 o'clock feel like twilight. Maribel was dusting the mantelpiece in the main living room when she noticed Nathan standing before a photograph she'd carefully cleaned around for weeks but never really examined. It showed a woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, her arm linked through Nathan's, both of them dressed for some formal event but looking genuinely happy rather than merely posed. "That was taken at the Children's Hospital Gala," Nathan said quietly, not looking at Maribel, but aware of her presence in the way that people become when grief makes them need witnesses. Emma insisted we go even though she was already sick. She said the kids needed to see people showing up for them, that if we could afford the tickets, we could afford to care. Maribel continued her dusting with movements so gentle they barely disturbed the air, giving him space to continue without feeling pressured to fill the silence. "She died in February," he said, his voice carrying the flat matter-of-factness that comes after you've said something too many times. "Cancer. We fought it for 18 months with every treatment money could buy, every specialist, every experimental therapy, spent nearly $2 million trying to save her life, and you know what? I'd spend it again, every penny." He turned away from the photograph to look directly at Maribel for the first time in their conversation. "People think I lost everything because of bad business decisions, market fluctuations, poor investment choices, trusting the wrong partners, and those things happened. That's all true. But the real reason I'm broke is because I chose my wife's life over my portfolio, and I'd make the same choice again tomorrow." Maribel set down her dusting cloth and faced him fully, recognizing the weight of a confession that had been carried alone for too long. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who knew intimately what loss could cost, "love isn't supposed to come with a good return on investment." Something shifted in Nathan's expression, not quite a smile, but a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained around his grief. "The accountants would disagree with you," he said. "The accountants never held her hand during chemotherapy," Maribel replied. "They never watched her fight for one more day. One more conversation, one more chance to tell you she loved you. Money's just numbers on paper until you need it to buy something that can't be bought." Nathan sank into one of the formal chairs he rarely used, suddenly looking less like a fallen businessman and more like a widower who'd been carrying too much alone for too long. "She made me promise her something before she died," he said. "Made me promise I wouldn't let losing her make me forget how to live. But I don't know how to live without her. We were married for 26 years. She was better at being human than I ever was." Maribel understood then that the coldness she'd felt in the house wasn't just from reduced heating or financial stress. It was the specific chill that comes when someone stops believing in the future, stops investing in daily life because the person who made life worth living is no longer there to share it with. "When my husband died," she said, settling into a chair across from him with the natural ease of someone who knew that some conversations required sitting down, "I thought the world had made a mistake. Roberto was the one who remembered birthdays, who knew how to fix everything that broke, who made me laugh when I forgot how. I was so angry at God, at the factory that didn't follow safety protocols, at Roberto himself for leaving me alone with 2 children and a mortgage, and no idea how to be both mother and father." Nathan listened with the intensity of someone hearing his own story told in a different language. "For almost a year after he died, I just existed," Maribel continued. "Got up, went to work, came home, took care of the children, went to bed. Like I was sleepwalking through my own life. The children needed me to be strong, but I felt like I was made of paper, like the first strong wind would blow me away completely." "What changed?" Nathan asked. "My daughter Maria came home from school one day crying because some kids were teasing her about her father being dead. She asked me if Daddy was watching us from heaven, and I told her yes, because that's what you tell children. But then she asked if Daddy was sad because Mommy stopped singing." Maribel's voice grew softer, carrying the weight of a memory that still had the power to reshape her. "I didn't even realize I'd stopped singing. Before Roberto died, I sang all the time, while cooking, while cleaning, while folding laundry. Stupid songs, church songs, songs that came on the radio. But after he died, the music just stopped. Did you start again? Nathan asked. Singing. Not right away, Maribel admitted, but I realized that my children needed to see me choosing to live, not just survive. They needed to know that terrible things could happen and we could still find reasons to sing. So I started small, humming while I cooked, listening to music while I cleaned. Not because I felt like it, but because they needed to see that it was possible. And eventually, you felt like it again? Eventually, Maribel said. Not the same as before. Grief changes the music, makes it more complicated, gives it deeper notes. But yes, eventually I remembered why Emma Roberts sings, why music matters, why the world needs people who refuse to let loss have the last word. Nathan sat quietly for several minutes, processing this exchange in the context of his own frozen grief. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the house, the old heating system clicked and hummed as it struggled to keep the cold at bay. I don't know how to start, he said finally. You don't start with the big things, Maribel replied. You start with tomorrow. You wake up and you make coffee and you drink it while it's hot instead of letting it get cold on your desk. You eat lunch at lunchtime instead of forgetting about it until dinner. Small things, human things, the kind of things Emma would want you to do. That evening, Maribel prepared dinner as she always did. But this time, Nathan joined her in the kitchen while she cooked. He didn't help. He was clearly unfamiliar with the practical mechanics of meal preparation, but he sat at the kitchen table and asked questions about her children, about Chicago, about the best route home on the L train when the weather was bad. It was the first real conversation they'd had that wasn't about work schedules or household maintenance, and something in the house seemed to settle differently around them, as if the rooms themselves were exhaling tension they'd held for months. As Maribel prepared to leave that evening, Nathan walked her to the front door, a small courtesy he'd never extended before. Mrs. Restrepo, he said as she pulled on her coat. Thank you. For everything. She nodded, understanding that his gratitude encompassed more than just clean floors and organized meals. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Whitman. Walking toward the L station, Maribel felt the first stirring of something she hadn't expected when she took this job. Hope. Not hope that Nathan's financial situation would improve, though she wished that for him, but hope that he might remember how to be alive in his own life again, how to inhabit his days with intention rather than just enduring them. She thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece, about Emma Whitman's smile, about the kind of love that would bankrupt a fortune to buy 18 more months of morning coffee and evening conversation. She thought about the promise Nathan had made to his dying wife, and wondered if maybe, tomorrow, he might start finding ways to keep it. The December wind cut through Chicago with the precision of a blade, and in the Whitman mansion, something remarkable began to happen. It started small. Nathan began joining Maribel in the kitchen while she prepared meals, initially standing awkwardly by the window, but gradually settling into a chair at the small breakfast table where Emma used to read the morning news on her tablet. The conversations grew longer, deeper, moving from polite exchanges about the weather to stories about their children, their losses, their fears about futures that felt uncertain. Nathan learned that Maribel's son Carlos was studying engineering at community college while working nights at a warehouse, that her daughter Maria had graduated nursing school but struggled to find full-time work at hospitals that seemed to prefer hiring younger, cheaper staff. Maribel learned that Nathan's relationship with his own children was complicated by years of being too busy building wealth to build connection, that Sarah lived in suburban perfection but rarely called, that Michael had never held a job for longer than 6 months, and seemed to view his father's financial collapse as a personal betrayal. I spent their whole childhood telling them that success meant working harder than everyone else, sacrificing more, wanting more, Nathan said one afternoon as they sat in the kitchen warming their hands around coffee cups while snow fell steadily outside the windows. I thought I was teaching them ambition. Turns out I was teaching them to measure love by bank account balances. Maribel listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that some truths had to be spoken out loud before they could be changed. Children learn what we show them, she said, but they also learn from what they choose to do with what we show them. Your children are grown now. They get to decide what kind of people they want to be. Sarah calls once a month like it's a duty, Nathan continued. Michael only calls when he needs money, which he can't ask for anymore because there isn't any to give. I keep thinking about all the school plays I missed, all the bedtime stories Emma read alone because I was working late. I built an empire and lost my family in the process. Your family isn't lost, Maribel said firmly. Distant maybe, hurt probably, but not lost. People can change how they relate to each other if they decide it's worth the effort. As winter deepened, Nathan began taking small steps toward rejoining his own life. He started reading books instead of just financial reports, rediscovering authors Emma had loved. He began taking short walks around the neighborhood despite the cold, reacquainting himself with the city beyond his study window. Most significantly, he started cooking simple meals with Maribel's patient guidance, learning to scramble eggs and make grilled cheese sandwiches with the concentration of someone who delegated such basic tasks for so long they'd become foreign territory. Emma used to make the most amazing holiday cookies, he said one December afternoon, as he carefully stirred a pot of soup under Maribel's supervision. Dozens of different kinds. She'd start baking right after Thanksgiving and fill every container in the house. The kids would come home from college and eat themselves sick on snickerdoodles and gingerbread men. Do you have her recipes? Maribel asked. Nathan's stirring slowed. Somewhere. She kept them in a little wooden box that her mother gave her. I couldn't look at it after she died. Too painful. Maybe this year, Maribel suggested gently. You could look at it. Not to make the cookies, that might be too much, but just to remember her hands writing down the ingredients, her voice explaining how much vanilla to add. The next day, Nathan appeared in the kitchen carrying a small wooden recipe box worn smooth by decades of handling. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, revealing index cards covered in Emma's careful handwriting. Some stained with butter and flour from years of use. Look at this, he said, holding up a card titled Roberto's Favorite Chocolate Chip Cookies in Emma's neat script. She named them after your husband. Maribel moved closer to see the card, and her own hands began to tremble. Roberto had such a sweet tooth, she said quietly. Mrs. Emma, she always sent cookies home with me after the holidays. Said they were for my family, but I think she knew they were mostly for Roberto. They spent the afternoon going through the recipes together, Nathan sharing memories of Emma's baking disasters and triumphs, while Maribel remembered the kindness that had come home in Tupperware containers and careful instructions about which cookies traveled best and which ones had to be eaten immediately. She talked about you, Nathan said as they reached the bottom of the box. After you started working here, said you had good hands, gentle but strong, said you understood how to take care of things without fussing over them. She was a good woman, Maribel replied, kind to people who most rich people don't even see. She saw everyone, Nathan agreed. That was her gift. She could walk into a room and immediately know who needed attention, who needed encouragement, who needed to be left alone. I was so focused on business that I forgot to pay attention to humans. As Christmas approached, Nathan made his first major decision since Emma's death that wasn't motivated by financial necessity or legal obligation. He decided to host a small Christmas dinner, not the elaborate entertaining they'd once done, but something simple and genuine. He called Sarah and Michael, extending invitations with the nervous uncertainty of someone who'd forgotten how to be a father rather than just a provider. I don't know if they'll come, he told Maribel, as they planned a menu that would stretch his reduced budget while still feeling special. I don't know if I know how to talk to them anymore. You'll figure it out, Maribel said with the confidence of someone who'd watched him learn to scramble eggs without burning them. Love is like riding a bicycle. You don't forget how, you just get out of practice. 3 days before Christmas, both children called to accept their father's invitation, their voices carrying surprise and curiosity about this unexpected gesture from a man who'd seemed to disappear into his own grief and financial troubles. On Christmas Eve, as Maribel prepared to leave for her own family gathering, she found Nathan in the kitchen making a practice batch of Emma's sugar cookies, his face intense with concentration as he rolled dough to exactly the thickness specified on the worn index card. "They won't be as good as hers," he said without looking up from his work. "They don't have to be," Maribel replied. "They just have to be made with love." She left him there, flower in his hair and determination in his movements, a man slowly learning how to inhabit his own life again, how to create rather than just consume, how to offer rather than just take. Outside, the snow continued falling on Chicago, covering the city in the clean white possibility that comes with winter weather and new beginnings. For the first time since Emma's death, Nathan Whitman was making something with his own hands, something he could give rather than something he could buy, something that carried memory and hope in equal measure. It was a small beginning, but beginnings don't have to be grand to be real. They just have to be genuine and willing and brave enough to try again. When Maribel returned after Christmas, she found the house transformed not by expensive decorations or professional cleaning, but by the evidence of life lived with intention. There were cookie crumbs on the counter that Nathan hadn't bothered to clean up yet, wine glasses in the sink from dinner with his children, a jigsaw puzzle half completed on the dining room table, where Sarah had apparently stayed late into the evening working on a winter landscape with her father. "How did it go?" she asked. Though Nathan's face already provided much of the answer, he looked tired but genuinely rested for the first time since she'd known him, like someone who'd remembered what it felt like to sleep peacefully. "Better than I expected," Nathan said, pouring coffee for both of them with the ease of someone who'd grown comfortable in his own kitchen. "Michael brought his girlfriend. I'd never met her before. Nina. She's a teacher, works with kids who have learning disabilities, smart, funny, doesn't seem impressed by money or the lack of it. I liked her." He sat down across from Maribel, his movements carrying less of the careful control that had marked his behavior for months. "And Sarah, we talked, really talked. She told me she'd always felt like she had to be perfect because I seemed to expect perfection from everyone around me. Said she was afraid to tell me when things went wrong in her life because she thought I'd see her problems as failures." "What did you tell her?" "That I was sorry, that I'd confused success with happiness for so long that I'd forgotten they weren't the same thing, that I wanted to know about her problems not so I could fix them, but so she wouldn't have to carry them alone." Maribel nodded, understanding the weight of such admissions. "Children remember apologies longer than they remember mistakes," she said, "especially when the apologies come with changes in behavior." "I want to do things differently," Nathan continued. "I can't get back the time I lost with them, but maybe I can make better use of the time I have left. Michael's talking about going back to school. He wants to study social work, help kids age out of the foster care system. I told him I'd support him however I could, even if that just means believing in him instead of questioning his choices." As January settled over Chicago with its characteristic blend of bitter cold and stubborn resilience, Nathan and Maribel fell into a rhythm that felt less like employer and employee and more like two people who'd found unexpected understanding in each other's company. Nathan began helping with household tasks, not because he couldn't afford to pay someone else to do them, but because he was learning that the work of maintaining a life could be meditative, grounding, a way of connecting with the physical reality of existence rather than living entirely in the abstract world of numbers and negotiations. They cooked together, cleaned together, and gradually began to tackle the emotional archaeology of sorting through Emma's belongings. Clothes she'd loved, books she'd annotated, jewelry that held stories Nathan wanted to preserve for Sarah. Maribel's presence made these painful tasks bearable, her steady calm providing anchor when grief threatened to pull him under again. "I keep thinking I should feel guilty," Nathan said one afternoon as they folded Emma's sweaters for donation to a women's shelter she'd supported. "For learning to be happy again, for starting to look forward to things instead of just dreading them. "Guilt is just love with nowhere to go," Maribel replied, smoothing a cashmere cardigan that still held the faint scent of Emma's perfume. "Mrs. Emma wouldn't want your love for her to become a prison. She'd want it to become a foundation for building something good." "You speak about her like you really knew her," Nathan observed. "I did know her," Maribel said simply. "Not the way you knew her, but I knew her kindness, her attention to people others ignored, the way she never made anyone feel small. That's knowing someone in a way that matters." By February, the anniversary month of Emma's death, Nathan had begun volunteering at the Children's Hospital where he and Emma had attended so many fundraising galas. But instead of writing checks from the comfortable distance of wealth, he was reading to kids during chemotherapy treatments, helping teenagers with homework in the waiting room, learning the names and stories of families navigating the same terrifying journey he and Emma had traveled. "It's different when you're not the one writing the check," he told Maribel after his first volunteer shift. "When you're just another person trying to help instead of the patron everyone has to be grateful to. The kids don't care that I used to be rich. They just want someone to listen to their stories and help them forget about being sick for a while." Maribel watched this transformation with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd always known that Nathan's coldness was grief rather than cruelty, that his dismissal of others had been self-protection rather than genuine arrogance. She saw him learning to find purpose in presence rather than presence, meaning in connection rather than control. But she also knew that healing isn't linear, that people who've suffered major losses can have setbacks, moments when old patterns reassert themselves, when fear overrides growth. She wasn't prepared for how quickly everything could change, how a single moment of weakness could unravel months of progress, how trust that had been carefully built could be shattered by one terrible decision made in a moment of panic and pain. The blow came in March, just as Chicago was beginning to show the first tentative signs of spring, when the betrayal that would test everything they'd built together arrived wearing the familiar face of staff gossip and the cruel mathematics of desperation. The accusation came on a Tuesday morning when Chicago's March wind carried the contradiction of winter cold and spring promise, when the trees along Astor Street showed the first brave buds despite the lingering threat of snow. Maribel arrived at her usual time to find Mrs. Henderson waiting in the kitchen with an expression that mixed righteousness with barely concealed satisfaction. "We need to talk," Mrs. Henderson announced before Maribel had even removed her coat. "Before Mr. Whitman comes down." Maribel set down her bag with the careful deliberation of someone who sensed trouble but wasn't willing to be hurried into responding to it. "What about?" "Mrs. Emma's diamond watch," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "The one Mr. Whitman gave her for their 20th anniversary. It's missing from her jewelry box." The words hit Maribel like a physical blow. Not because she was surprised by the accusation. She'd worked for enough wealthy families to know that missing items were almost always blamed on the help, but because she'd believed this house was different, that her relationship with Nathan had transcended such ugly suspicions. "I don't know anything about a missing watch," Maribel said quietly, her voice steady despite the way her heart had begun beating faster. "It was there last week when I was helping Mr. Whitman go through Mrs. Emma's things," Mrs. Henderson continued, her eyes bright with the cruelty that sometimes emerges in people who've felt powerless too long and suddenly find themselves holding cards. "Now it's gone. You're the only person who's been in that room since then." "That's not true," Maribel replied. "Mr. Whitman's children were here over the weekend. James was here yesterday fixing the window latch in the master bedroom. You've been up there yourself." "But none of us need the money the way you do," Mrs. Henderson said with false sympathy. "We all know you're struggling to pay your son's college tuition, that your daughter's been looking for work. Desperate people do desperate things." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Nathan's footsteps moving around upstairs. Maribel stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of an injustice that was both deeply personal and historically familiar. The automatic assumption that the person with the least power must be responsible for anything that went wrong. I have never stolen anything in my life, Maribel said, her voice carrying the dignity of someone who'd been tested by loss and hardship, but never compromised her integrity. Not from this house, not from any house I've worked in. Then where's the watch? Mrs. Henderson demanded. Before Maribel could respond, Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in the casual clothes he'd begun wearing instead of business suits, his face carrying the relaxed expression of someone who'd slept well and was looking forward to the day ahead. The expression changed instantly when he saw the tension in the room. "What's going on?" he asked. Mrs. Henderson straightened, assuming the authoritative posture of someone delivering unpleasant but necessary news. "Mr. Whitman, I'm afraid we have a situation. Emma's diamond watch, the anniversary gift, it's missing from her jewelry box." Nathan's face went blank in the way that meant he was processing information too quickly for his emotions to keep up. "Missing? I noticed it yesterday when I was organizing the jewelry for your donation," Mrs. Henderson continued. "I know it was there last week because I specifically remembered thinking about how much Mrs. Emma loved that watch. Now it's gone." Nathan's eyes moved to Maribel, and in that glance she saw something that cut deeper than the accusation itself. She saw doubt, not certainty of her guilt, but the terrible moment when trust wavered, when faith in someone's character competed with the practical reality of a missing expensive item and the statistical likelihood of staff theft. "Mrs. Restrepo," Nathan said carefully, "do you know anything about Emma's watch?" The question hung in the air like smoke, polluting everything it touched. Maribel met his eyes directly, refusing to look away despite the pain of seeing uncertainty where she'd grown accustomed to seeing respect. "No, Mr. Whitman," she said clearly. "I don't know anything about your wife's watch. I've never taken anything from this house." "She's the only one who's been in that room unsupervised," Mrs. Henderson pressed, her voice taking on the urgent tone of someone who sensed victory within reach. "And everyone knows she's been having financial troubles. Her son's tuition, her daughter's unemployment." "That's enough," Nathan said sharply, but his tone suggested he was stopping the conversation rather than dismissing the suspicion. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room. Maribel could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of two sets of eyes evaluating her, could sense the careful relationship she'd built with Nathan over months of shared grief and gradual healing, suddenly becoming fragile as spun glass. "I think," Nathan said slowly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone making a decision he didn't want to make, but felt compelled to reach, "it would be best if we took a break from the working arrangement until we can figure out what happened to the watch." The words hit Maribel like a betrayal she should have expected, but somehow hadn't prepared for. After months of conversations about loss and trust, after watching him learn to cook eggs and reading Emma's recipe cards together, after becoming witness to his grief and partner in his healing, he was choosing to believe the worst of her based on nothing more than proximity and prejudice. "I understand," Maribel said quietly, her dignity intact even as her heart broke. "I'll get my things." She moved through the kitchen gathering her supplies with the same methodical care she brought to everything, refusing to hurry despite the humiliation burning in her chest, refusing to give Mrs. Henderson the satisfaction of seeing her flustered or desperate. Nathan stood frozen in the doorway, watching her pack with an expression that suggested he was already beginning to regret his decision, but was too proud or too fearful to reverse it immediately. "Mrs. Restrepo," he said as she zipped up her bag, "if the watch turns up, if there's been a misunderstanding." "There has been a misunderstanding," Maribel replied, not looking at him, "but not about the watch." She walked past him toward the front door, past Mrs. Henderson, whose expression mixed triumph with something that might have been shame, past the rooms where she'd slowly helped Nathan remember how to live again. At the door, she turned back one final time. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything they'd shared and everything they were losing, "I hope you find what you're looking for, and I hope it's worth what you're giving up to look for it." The door closed behind her with the soft finality of a chapter ending badly, leaving Nathan alone with Mrs. Henderson and the hollow knowledge that he'd just chosen fear over faith, suspicion over loyalty. The easy judgment over the harder work of trust. Outside, the March wind cut through Maribel's coat as she walked toward the L station, each step taking her away from a job that had become more than employment, from a relationship that had felt like genuine connection, from a man who'd forgotten in one crucial moment everything they had learned about seeing beyond surfaces to recognize the character underneath. The train that carried her home was crowded with Tuesday morning commuters, people heading toward their own jobs and responsibilities, their own complicated relationships with the families they served, the employers who held their economic futures in hands that could be generous or cruel, depending on circumstances beyond anyone's control. Maribel sat among them, another woman in work clothes heading home earlier than usual, carrying a betrayal that felt both deeply personal and boringly familiar. She had no way of knowing that Nathan was already beginning to doubt his decision, that Mrs. Henderson's victory would be shorter than she imagined, or that the truth about the missing watch would surface in a way that would force everyone involved to confront the difference between what they assumed and what they actually knew. For now, there was only the train moving through Chicago's gray morning, carrying her away from Astor Street toward a future that suddenly felt much less certain than it had when she'd waked up that morning, believing she understood where she belonged and who she could trust to see her clearly. The days following Maribel's dismissal passed like a slow fever for Nathan, each one bringing a deeper awareness of what he'd lost, along with a growing certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake. The house felt different without her steady presence, not just less clean, though it was that, but less alive, as if the warmth she'd brought had been essential to making the space habitable rather than just livable. Mrs. Henderson continued coming 3 days a week, but her satisfaction at removing Maribel had curdled into something uncomfortable as she watched Nathan move through his days with increasing listlessness. The conversations that had animated their morning coffee routine disappeared, replaced by the hollow politeness of employer and employee who no longer quite trusted each other. Nathan found himself standing in the kitchen at odd hours, remembering the sound of Maribel's humming as she cooked, the way she'd organized the spice cabinet not just alphabetically but by frequency of use, the gentle authority with which she'd guided him through making his first successful batch of Emma's sugar cookies. The children's hospital called twice to ask if he was feeling well. He'd missed his volunteer shifts for the first time since starting, claiming illness, but sounding more lost than sick. Sarah phoned expressing concern about his subdued responses during their now regular Sunday conversations, the way he seemed to have retreated into the distant politeness that had characterized their relationship before Christmas. Even Michael noticed the change, commenting during a midweek check-in that his father sounded like he was sleepwalking through his words. The truth revealed itself with the casual cruelty of most important discoveries, not through dramatic confrontation, but through mundane coincidence. Nathan was helping Sarah clean out the guest room closet in preparation for a visit from her children when they found a box of Michael's belongings that he'd left behind during his hasty departure from the house the previous summer, angry about his father's financial situation and embarrassed by the family's reduced circumstances. Among the old college textbooks and forgotten electronics, wrapped carefully in a sock and tucked inside a shoebox, was Emma's diamond watch. "Oh my God," Sarah said, holding the watch up to catch the light from the bedroom window. "Isn't this Mom's anniversary watch? The one you gave her for 20 years? Nathan stared at the watch as if he were seeing a ghost, which, in a way, he was. The ghost of his own terrible judgment, of his willingness to believe the worst about someone who'd shown him nothing but loyalty and kindness, of the cowardice that had led him to choose the easy accusation over the difficult faith. Michael must have taken it, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the complicated mix of disappointment and protective understanding that comes with loving someone whose weaknesses you can't fix. Probably when he was so angry about the money situation. He's always been impulsive when he's upset. Nathan sank onto the edge of the bed, the watch heavy in his hands with more than just the weight of gold and diamonds. It carried the weight of accusation made and trust broken, of a woman who'd been dismissed from her job based on suspicion and prejudice, of his own failure to be the man Emma had loved and the man he'd been learning to become with Maribel's patient guidance. "Dad?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" "I fired her," Nathan said quietly. "I fired Mrs. Restrepo because we thought she stole this watch." Sarah's expression changed as she processed the implications. "Oh no, Dad, you have to call her. You have to apologize." "I don't think an apology is going to be enough," Nathan replied, remembering the dignity with which Maribel had walked out of his house, the way she'd maintained her composure, even as he was choosing to believe gossip over everything he knew about her character. "I don't think I deserve forgiveness for this." But Sarah, who'd inherited her mother's practical wisdom along with her capacity for hope, wasn't willing to let him surrender to guilt without attempting repair. "Maybe you don't deserve it," she said firmly, "but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Mom always said the measure of a person wasn't whether they made mistakes, but whether they had the courage to make them right." That evening, Nathan sat in his study holding the watch and trying to find words that could possibly convey the depth of his regret. He drafted and discarded a dozen letters, each one sounding either too formal or too casual, too presumptuous or too distant. How do you apologize for choosing fear over trust? How do you acknowledge that you've wounded someone's dignity in a way that mere words can't heal? Finally, he set aside the pen and paper and reached for his phone. Dialing the number that Maribel had provided for work references, knowing that hearing her voice would be harder than writing words, but also knowing that some apologies required the vulnerability of real-time conversation. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice carrying the cautious politeness of someone who'd learned to be wary of unexpected calls. "Mrs. Restrepo," Nathan said, his own voice sounding foreign to himself. "This is Nathan Whitman. I need to talk to you." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Nathan to wonder if she'd hung up, but finally she spoke. "Mr. Whitman, we found the watch," he said, abandoning all the careful phrasing he'd rehearsed and going straight to the heart of it. Emma's watch. Michael had taken it. It was never missing from the jewelry box. We just didn't know he'd borrowed it months ago. Another silence, this one feeling heavier than the first. "I see," Maribel said finally, her voice neutral in a way that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Mrs. Restrepo, I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give," Nathan continued. "I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. I let fear and suspicion override everything I knew about your character, everything you'd shown me about who you are. I failed you and I failed myself, and I failed Emma's memory by acting like the kind of man she would have been ashamed to be married to." "Mr. Whitman," Maribel's voice carried a weariness that suggested she'd been through this conversation before, in different contexts, with different employers. "I appreciate you calling. Thank you for letting me know about the watch." "That's not why I called," Nathan said quickly, sensing that she was preparing to end the conversation. "I called because I want you to come back, because I need you to come back, not as an employee, as, I don't know what to call it, a partner in trying to figure out how to live like a decent human being." The silence stretched long enough for Nathan to hear the sound of traffic in the background, suggesting that Maribel was somewhere outside, possibly on her way to or from another job, the life she'd been forced to rebuild because of his suspicion and cowardice. "I have a new position," she said finally, "with the Morrison family. They seem like good people." Nathan felt something crumble inside his chest, not just disappointment, but the recognition that consequences sometimes can't be undone by apologies, that trust, once broken, doesn't automatically heal just because the breaking was revealed to be unjustified. "Of course," he said. "Of course you do. I wanted you to know that I know I was wrong, that losing you was the real theft that happened in that house." After Maribel ended the call with careful courtesy, Nathan sat alone in his study, the recovered watch on his desk catching light from the lamp Emma had chosen, because she said it made reading more pleasant in the evening. He thought about second chances, and whether everyone deserved them, about the difference between earning forgiveness and simply wanting it, about what Emma would have told him to do if she were still alive to offer guidance. Outside his windows, Chicago settled into another March evening, the wind carrying the promise of change that comes with spring, but also the reminder that some changes can't be reversed, that some seasons end without guarantee of renewal, and that sometimes the cost of learning who you really are includes losing the people who could have helped you become who you wanted to be. The watch ticked quietly on his desk, marking time that couldn't be reclaimed, measuring the distance between the man who'd made accusations and the man who now had to live with their consequences. Spring arrived in Chicago with its characteristic determination, pushing through the resistance of winter with green shoots that appeared overnight and temperatures that rose just enough to remind the city's residents that suffering was temporary, that renewal was always possible even when it seemed impossible to believe. But in Nathan's house, the changing season felt more like an indictment than a promise, evidence of life continuing without him, moving forward while he remained stuck in the consequences of his own poor judgment. The Morrison family, Maribel had said. Nathan found himself wondering about them with the obsessive curiosity of someone who'd lost something irreplaceable and couldn't stop imagining it flourishing in someone else's care. Were they kind to her? Did they appreciate her steady competence, her gentle wisdom, her ability to transform a house into a home through nothing more than consistent presence and genuine care? Did they deserve her in ways that he clearly hadn't? Michael called on a Thursday evening to confess about the watch, his voice carrying the shame of someone who'd been forced to confront the consequences of his impulsive choices. He'd taken it during one of his angry departures from the house, he explained, planning to pawn it to spite his father, but ultimately unable to go through with selling something that had belonged to his mother. Instead, he'd kept it hidden, meaning to return it, but forgetting about it as his life became consumed with work and relationship drama. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Michael said, his voice cracking in a way that took Nathan back to childhood apologies for broken windows and missed curfews. "I never meant for anyone else to get blamed. I didn't even know you'd hired someone new until Sarah told me what happened." Nathan listened to his son's confession with the complicated emotions of someone whose anger was tempered by recognition of his own failures, the years of modeling that success meant taking what you wanted regardless of consequences, the example he'd set that money was more important than integrity, the family dynamic that had taught his children to see service staff as interchangeable rather than irreplaceable. "We both made mistakes," Nathan told his son, because blame was easier to share than to bear alone. "But I'm the one who chose suspicion over trust. I'm the one who let someone else pay the price for our family's problems." The conversation left Nathan feeling more isolated than before, haunted by the recognition that his children were carrying forward patterns he'd established, making choices that reflected values he'd taught them without meaning to, perpetuating cycles of carelessness toward people whose lives intersected with theirs. He began taking longer walks through the city, partly because staying in the house reminded him too acutely of Maribel's absence, but mostly because movement felt necessary when sitting still became unbearable. His routes took him through neighborhoods where she might live, past bus stops where she might wait, through the geography of working-class Chicago where people like her kept the city running through their invisible labor. It was on one of these walks, 3 weeks after their phone conversation, that he saw her. She was emerging from a small grocery store on North Avenue, carrying bags with the careful balance of someone who'd learned to manage multiple burdens efficiently. She looked exactly as he remembered, composed, purposeful, moving through the world with the quiet dignity that had first caught his attention and ultimately earned his respect. But something in her posture suggested weariness that went beyond physical tiredness, a heaviness that made Nathan wonder if his betrayal had cost her more than just employment. He found himself crossing the street before he'd consciously decided to approach her, drawn by an urgency that had been building for weeks, the need to see her face and attempt once more to convey the depth of his regret and the sincerity of his desire to make amends. "Mrs. Restrepo," he called when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. She turned, and for a moment her expression showed genuine surprise before it settled into the careful neutrality she'd maintained during their phone conversation. "Mr. Whitman," she said, shifting her grocery bags to one hand as if preparing for a conversation she wasn't sure she wanted to have. "I don't want to keep you," Nathan said, suddenly aware of how this encounter might look to her, the former employer who'd wronged her now appearing in her neighborhood, intruding on her personal time and space. Seeing you. I needed to tell you again how sorry I am." Maribel studied his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people's intentions, to distinguish between genuine remorse and mere guilt, between apologies offered for the sake of the apologizer and those offered for the sake of the wounded. "I heard you the first time," she said quietly. "I know you have a new job," Nathan continued, his words coming faster as he sensed her preparing to leave. "I know you're probably happier working for people who trust you from the beginning, but I want you to know that losing you didn't just make my house dirtier. It made my life smaller. You helped me remember how to be human again, and I repaid that gift by choosing to believe the worst about you based on nothing but other people's suspicions and my own fear." A bus rumbled past on North Avenue, and in its wake, the silence between them felt less hostile than simply sad, heavy with the recognition that some damage couldn't be undone by acknowledgement alone. "Mr. Whitman," Maribel said finally, her voice carrying the patience of someone who'd dealt with many employers, many apologies, many promises that ultimately meant less than the people making them hoped they would. "I don't need you to keep apologizing. I need you to learn something from what happened so it doesn't happen to the next person." The simplicity of her response, the way she focused on prevention rather than punishment, on growth rather than guilt, reminded Nathan why he'd valued her presence so much and why losing it had felt like losing a piece of his better self. "The Morrison family," he said, grasping for some way to extend the conversation. "Are they good to you?" "They're fine," Maribel replied, but something in her tone suggested that fine was a long way from the connection they'd shared, the sense of mutual respect and genuine collaboration that had made her work in his house feel like partnership rather than mere employment. Nathan nodded, understanding that he'd used up whatever right he'd had to details about her life, that their relationship now existed in the past tense, that all he could do was hope she'd eventually remember the good parts without being overwhelmed by how it had ended. "Mrs. Restrepo," he said as she prepared to continue her walk home, "if you ever need anything, a reference, help with an emergency, anything at all, please don't let what I did stop you from calling. You don't owe me forgiveness, but I owe you whatever assistance I can provide for the rest of our lives." She looked at him for a long moment, and Nathan thought he saw something soften in her expression, some acknowledgement that his regret was genuine, even if it couldn't undo what had been done. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Whitman," she said, and then she was walking away. Her grocery bags balanced expertly, her steps sure and steady as she moved toward whatever life she was building without him. Nathan stood on the sidewalk watching her disappear into the crowd of evening pedestrians, carrying his apology and his offer, and the knowledge that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you've wronged is give them space to heal without your presence, even when your absence feels like another kind of punishment you have to bear. The walk home took him through the city he'd once commanded, and now simply inhabited, past buildings that held his former wealth and current isolation, toward a house that no longer felt like home without someone there who understood both who he'd been and who he was trying to become. Summer arrived in Chicago with the sudden intensity that made residents forget they'd ever doubted its coming, bringing days when the heat rose from the pavement like forgiveness, warm, enveloping, impossible to ignore. Nathan had fallen into routines that carried him through the weeks without Maribel, volunteer shifts at the children's hospital, longer conversations with his children, solitary meals that he cooked with the skills she'd taught him. But the satisfaction of these activities felt thin, like eating food that provided nutrition without offering pleasure. He'd let Mrs. Henderson go in May, not from anger, but from the recognition that keeping her felt like maintaining a lie about what had happened. preserving the fiction that the accusation against Maribel had been reasonable rather than the product of prejudice and his own failure of character. The house was quieter now, cleaner in some ways, but less alive, maintained by Nathan himself and a rotating series of cleaning services that were efficient but impersonal. The call came on a Tuesday evening in July from a number Nathan didn't recognize, but a voice he would have known anywhere. "Mr. Whitman," Maribel's voice carried an urgency he'd never heard before. "I need to ask you for help." Nathan's heart rate accelerated, not from surprise, but from the immediate recognition that whatever had prompted this call was serious enough to override months of careful distance, important enough to risk reopening communication she'd clearly preferred to keep closed. "Of course," he said. "Anything. What do you need?" "My son Carlos," Maribel said, and Nathan could hear the struggle in her voice, the effort it was taking to ask for assistance from someone who'd failed her so badly. "He's been arrested. It's a misunderstanding, but he's in jail, and I can't afford bail, can't afford a good lawyer. I know I don't have any right to ask you for this." "Where is he?" Nathan interrupted, already reaching for his car keys. "Which jail?" The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that felt more purposeful than anything Nathan had done since Maribel left his employment. Cook County Jail at midnight was a world unto itself, fluorescent lit and bureaucratic, filled with people whose stories intersected with the criminal justice system in ways that were often more about poverty than criminality. More about being in the wrong place with the wrong resources than about actual wrongdoing. Carlos, Nathan learned from the brief conversation they were allowed, had been arrested during a traffic stop that had escalated when police found a small amount of marijuana in his car. Not enough to suggest dealing, but enough to justify arrest in a city where possession enforcement often depended more on neighborhood and race than on actual substance involved. He was 22 years old, studying engineering while working night shifts to pay for school. Precisely the kind of young man Nathan had once been, before privilege and connections smoothed the rough edges from his path. The bail was set at $5,000, not an enormous sum for Nathan, even in his reduced circumstances, but more than Maribel could manage without sacrificing months of careful savings. Nathan paid it without hesitation, then arranged for a lawyer he knew who specialized in cases like this, young men whose futures could be derailed by minor drug charges if they couldn't afford proper representation. As they waited for Carlos to be processed out, Nathan and Maribel sat in plastic chairs under harsh lighting, surrounded by other families navigating their own crises, other mothers and fathers learning that the system designed to protect them often viewed their children as threats to be managed rather than citizens to be served. "I'll pay you back," Maribel said quietly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that showed in every line of her posture. "However long it takes." "This isn't a loan," Nathan replied. "This is me doing something I should have done months ago, showing you that I know the difference between right and wrong." "Still," Maribel insisted, "I don't want to owe you anything. I don't want this to become something you hold over me." Nathan turned to look at her directly, seeing in her profile the same dignity that had impressed him from their first meeting, the same strength that had helped him navigate his own crisis, the same grace that had forgiven worse treatment than anyone should have to endure. "Mrs. Restrepo," he said, "the only thing you owe me is the chance to prove that I'm not the man who accused you of theft, that I learned something from failing you so badly." When Carlos finally emerged from processing, tired, embarrassed, grateful beyond words, Nathan saw immediately why Maribel was so proud of him. Despite the ordeal, the young man carried himself with quiet dignity, thanking Nathan sincerely but not effusively, apologizing to his mother for the worry he'd caused without making excuses for the choices that had led to arrest. "It was stupid," Carlos admitted as they drove through Chicago's empty early morning streets toward Maribel's apartment. "I knew better. Things have been stressful with school and work, and I thought it would help me relax. I never thought about what would happen if I got caught." "We all make mistakes when we're tired and stressed," Nathan said, remembering his own poor judgment under pressure. The important thing is learning from them. At Maribel's building, a modest two-flat in a neighborhood where the houses stood close together and people knew their neighbor's business, Nathan helped carry Carlos's belongings and waited while mother and son had the kind of quiet conversation that families have after crisis has been averted, but lessons still need to be absorbed. As Nathan prepared to leave, Maribel walked him to his car, the summer dawn just beginning to break over the city they both called home. "Thank you," she said simply, "not just for the money but for coming, for treating Carlos like he mattered." "He does matter," Nathan replied, "and so do you, more than I showed you when you were working for me." They stood beside his car for a moment, two people whose lives had intersected in ways neither had expected, whose relationship had been tested by his failures, but somehow survived them, transformed into something different, but still valuable. "The Morrison family," Nathan said carefully. "Are you happy there?" Maribel was quiet for so long that Nathan wondered if she was going to ignore the question, but finally she spoke. "They're nice people," she said. "Polite. They pay me on time, never ask me to work extra hours without compensation. They treat me fairly." "But?" Nathan prompted gently. "But fair isn't the same as connected," Maribel admitted. "They see me as someone who provides a service, not as someone who might have insights about their lives, wisdom to offer along with clean floors. It's professional, but not personal." Nathan felt a stirring of hope that he tried to suppress, recognizing that his desire for her to be unhappy elsewhere was ultimately selfish, motivated more by his own loss than by concern for her well-being. "If you ever wanted to make a change," he said carefully, "my door's always open, not just as an employer, but as someone who values your friendship, who's learned to cook eggs without burning them, and read to sick children, and remember that being wealthy is about more than having money." Maribel smiled for the first time since he'd received her crisis call, and Nathan saw in that expression the warmth that had transformed his house from mansion to home, the wisdom that had guided him from grief toward healing. "Let me think about it," she said, and Nathan understood that this was more than he'd dared to hope for. More than he'd perhaps deserved, but exactly what he needed to believe that redemption was possible, that mistakes could be overcome, that trust, once broken, could sometimes be carefully, slowly rebuilt. As he drove home through Chicago's awakening streets, Nathan carried with him the memory of Maribel's smile and the knowledge that second chances were gifts that had to be earned rather than expected, that required patience rather than demand, and that came, when they came at all, not as returns to what was lost, but as opportunities to build something new and better from the wreckage of what had been broken. The autumn winds returned to Chicago with their familiar bite, carrying the scent of turning leaves and the promise of another winter to endure and somehow survive. Nathan had grown comfortable with solitude over the summer months, had learned to find satisfaction in routines that didn't depend on anyone else's presence or approval. His volunteer work at the Children's Hospital had expanded to include mentoring teenagers aging out of foster care, teaching basic financial literacy to young adults who'd never had anyone explain the difference between good debt and bad debt, between investment and speculation, between building wealth and simply earning money. It was through this work that he'd come to understand the difference between charity and justice, between writing checks to ease guilt and actually addressing the systemic inequalities that made charity necessary in the first place. Michael had joined him in some of these efforts, bringing his own experience with social work and his generation's impatience with half measures and comfortable compromises. The phone call came on a Thursday evening in October, just as Nathan was settling down with a book and a cup of coffee, made the way Maribel had taught him, strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth enough to drink without cream. "Mr. Whitman?" Her voice carried the same calm steadiness he remembered, but underneath it he detected something new. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of settled peace that hadn't been there during their summer encounter. "I've been thinking about what you said, about your door being open." Nathan set down his coffee with care, not wanting to make any sound that might interrupt what felt like the most important conversation he'd had in months. The Morrison family is lovely, Maribel continued, but you were right about the difference between fair and connected. They see me, but they don't really know me. And I think I miss being known. Are you asking about coming back to work? Nathan said carefully, not wanting to assume too much, not wanting to push too hard toward what he hoped she was offering. I'm asking about something different, Maribel said. Not just work, partnership. I want to help you with your volunteer projects, use my experience to help other families navigate crises like the one Carlos went through. I want to work somewhere that my insights matter as much as my ability to clean floors. What are you proposing? Nathan asked, though his heart was already racing with possibilities. A consulting arrangement, Maribel said with the confidence of someone who'd thought this through carefully. You need someone who understands how working families actually live, what challenges they face, how to build trust with people who've been let down by institutions before. I need work that feels meaningful, that uses everything I've learned from 22 years of taking care of other people's lives. That sounds perfect, Nathan said, then caught himself. But are you sure? After what happened between us, after the way I failed you when you needed me to trust you? People make mistakes, Maribel said, and Nathan heard in her voice an echo of the conversation they'd had in his kitchen about forgiveness and second chances, and learning to sing again after loss. The question isn't whether you made mistakes. The question is whether you learned from them. I did learn, Nathan said quietly. I learned that dignity isn't something you can afford to lose. I learned that trust is more valuable than any watch, any possession, any amount of money. I learned that the people who serve us often understand life better than the people who employ them, and that wisdom should be honored, not dismissed. Then we have a place to start, Maribel said, and Nathan could hear the smile in her voice. When do you want to begin? 2 weeks later, on a crisp November morning when the lake wind carried the promise of winter, Maribel walked up the front steps of the Astor Street mansion carrying a briefcase instead of cleaning supplies, dressed in professional clothes instead of work clothes, arriving not as an employee but as a partner in the work of helping people rebuild their lives after everything fell apart. Nathan met her at the door with coffee, made the way she'd taught him and pastries from the bakery she'd mentioned loving. Small gestures of hospitality that acknowledged the shift in their relationship from employer and staff to colleagues united by shared purpose. They spent the morning in his study, the same room where he'd once sat surrounded by financial documents that chronicled his losses, now transformed into an office where they planned programs to help families navigate legal troubles, educational challenges, healthcare crises, all the emergencies that could destabilize working-class lives faster than anyone outside those circumstances could imagine. The hardest part, Maribel said as they reviewed applications from families seeking assistance, isn't providing the money. It's providing it in a way that preserves dignity, that treats people as partners in solving their problems rather than recipients of charity who should be grateful and quiet. Nathan nodded, remembering his own resistance to accepting help when his wealth disappeared, the way pride could become a barrier to healing. Emma used to say that the best gifts were the ones that felt like friendship rather than charity. She was a wise woman, Maribel said, then looked up from the papers spread across the desk. Are we going to be okay, working together after everything that happened between us? Nathan met her eyes directly, seeing in them the same blend of strength and gentleness that had helped him remember how to be human after loss. Better than okay, he said. We're going to be necessary, for each other and for the people we're going to help. Outside the windows, Chicago settled into the rhythm of another autumn, another season of change and preparation, another cycle of endings that would eventually become beginnings. In the house on Astor Street, two people who'd found each other through service and lost each other through failure, and found each other again through forgiveness, sat planning how to extend that same cycle of loss and recovery and renewal to other families, other crises, other opportunities for grace. The work they were beginning wouldn't erase the past or guarantee the future, but it would honor the present, using everything they'd learned about resilience and dignity and the strange ways that broken people sometimes healed each other to build something larger than their individual stories, something that could outlast their personal relationship and serve the city that had shaped them both. Years later, when people asked Nathan about the partnership that had transformed his approach to wealth and service, he would tell them about a woman who'd taught him that wisdom often wore work clothes, that grace sometimes came with an accent, and that the most valuable inheritance you could leave wasn't money, but the memory of having treated every person who crossed your path as if their dignity mattered as much as your own. And when people asked Maribel about the man who'd wronged her and then spent years learning how to make it right, she would tell them about second chances that had to be earned rather than expected, about forgiveness that was different from forgetting, and about the strange arithmetic by which helping others rebuild their lives somehow helped you rebuild your own. Now, I want you to reflect on this story, to let it settle in your heart the way truth settles, slowly, deeply, changing you from the inside out. Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying thank you? Have you ever been the invisible thread holding a family or a life together, unseen but unbroken? Have you ever had to choose between pride and forgiveness, between the satisfaction of staying angry and the harder work of believing that people can change? Maybe you're listening to this while folding someone else's laundry, while riding a bus toward another day of invisible labor, while wondering if anyone notices the care you put into tasks that others take for granted. Maybe you've been accused of things you didn't do by people who found it easier to blame you than to examine their own assumptions. Maybe you've watched families from the outside while helping hold them together from the inside, seen their flaws and their beauty up close while they barely saw you at all. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever wondered whether your work matters, whether your dignity has value, whether the kindness you show to ungrateful people counts for anything in the cosmic sense, then this story is for you. It's a reminder that grace is often quiet, that strength sometimes looks like service, and that the people who heal the world usually do it one household, one family, one act of patient love at a time. Maribel Restrepo was never rich in money, but she was wealthy in the things that actually matter: dignity, wisdom, the ability to see people clearly and love them anyway. Nathan Whitman had to lose his fortune to learn what Maribel had always known, that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold, only given and received, only honored and protected, only passed from one generation to the next through the daily acts of love that make civilization possible. Share your story in the comments if this moved you. Tell us about the time you were invisible but essential, accused but innocent, dismissed but ultimately vindicated. Tell us about the employer who learned to see you, or the moment when you realized that your work was ministry, that your presence was a gift, that your life had meaning beyond what anyone's paycheck could measure. If this story touched something deep in your soul, leave a like and subscribe so it can reach other women who need to remember their worth, who need to know that their stories matter, who need to hear that dignity is not dependent on anyone else's recognition, but shines from within like an eternal flame that no accusation can extinguish. For more stories that honor the invisible armies of women who keep the world running through their love and labor, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional road with us, for allowing these words to remind you of your own strength and value. We'll see you in the next story, where we'll continue exploring the beautiful, complicated, sacred work of being human in a world that doesn't always make it easy. Until then, remember, you are seen, you are valued, and your story, whatever it is, however humble it might seem, is part of the great tapestry of love that holds this world together. Never forget that, and never let anyone convince you otherwise.